Welcome to the Date Forever podcast. Keep your relationship fueled up with strategies discovered by couples and experts. Because at Fuel Collective, we believe better relationships will equal a better world. You are about to discover specific insights and tools that cost little or nothing to implement to help you date forever. And now, here are your hosts, a couple who always have a half-packed suitcase and a date night in the calendar, Sammy and Nathan Yeager.
Hello and welcome to a brand new week of Date Forever. In this week's episode, we're chatting about what effective communication looks like within your relationship, understanding your boundaries and holding them firm, and how to create a safe space for open and vulnerable communication. But before we get into it, Sammy, what's been fueling you up this week?
I had a Sammy day. I had a self-datiest date. It was so good.
So what did you do? What did you get up to?
I had the whole day to myself. I had a sleep in and I did a few journaling things that have helped me kind of process a few things that I've had going on with work and just a few different opportunities that are sitting on the horizon. So I did a little bit of that and I chatted to my mum on the phone. Nice. I walked the dog. I went to the gym and I made myself a really delicious, nourishing lunch. Then I kind of just hung out for the afternoon in my own company. And then I drank tequila and made tacos.
That sounds delicious. It sounds amazing.
It was so good.
So what prompted this day?
I just you were away. You were away. And now I feel like I understand why you get so excited when I go away. Because normally it's me who's away.
I do love a bit of my own time.
Yeah, it was so nice. I did no work. Normally, no output kind of work. Nothing for clients, nothing for my job, nothing for our business, nothing for the podcast. I just did me kind of stuff, which is quite unusual for me. So, yeah, it was good.
Very nice.
What about you, Nath? What was fueling you up this past week?
So I think the day that you mentioned that I was away, I was out playing my first game of footy, which was pretty exciting. So I had a pretty quiet first half, but got into it in the second half, which was really good. Had a couple of good kicks and marks and felt like I made a good contribution to the game. So, it felt really great.
But why did that fuel you up?
Well, I guess I've been training since I think February now. And so it's kind of felt like I've been a little bit part of the community, but the actual outcome hadn't really realized itself yet. I've just been going to training and putting a little bit of effort, but not actually played a game yet. So it was just, really nice to be part of the team and to actually put all of my training into practice.
So was it the element of it coming to fruition that made it feel like a fuel up, or was it something else?
Yeah, it was a bit of coming into fruition. Certainly something that I find even in my day job and stuff like that's a part which really kind of fuels me up, is actually seeing something turn to life. So I think that was the part that really did fuel me up, was me actually getting out on the field and feeling like the thing that I've been working towards is actually happening. So
what about the element of stepping into your masculine?
Oh, definitely some of that too. Yeah. Tackling a few guys and taking a few hits. Yeah, being a bit rough. And I haven't really done anything like that for a while. I mean, I get a little bit through mountain biking and stuff like that, being outdoors and getting a bit dirty and having a few close shaves and stuff like that. But yeah, it was nice to feel a bit masculine too.
So do you think it was your sense of self that was fueled up, or was it your relationship and network and that plugging into a community, or what tank was it that got full?
Well, it's probably aspects of a lot of things, definitely aspects of relationships and network and tapping into the community, feeling a part of a team and part of a club and feeling like I'd actually made a contribution towards that. That was definitely a part of it. And getting some praise from other people too. It just felt really nice. And I think some of that self, accomplishment and putting my mind to something and that I can actually do and achieve new things and grow and just, kind of the understanding that I can move forward and can learn new things and can improve.
Yeah, well, I know that joining a footy team or joining a sports team of some kind has been on the horizon for a long time.
Yeah, it has been.
So I'm really proud of you.
Thank you.
And on a slightly more selfish motivation, I hope you keep playing so I keep getting my Saturdays to myself.
So now let's introduce this week's guest.
Today we're welcoming Charlotte Lane. She's affectionately known as the communication queen with her clients, has spent the past 6 years honing her communication skills both in Australia and abroad with one mission in mind, to create a world where clear communication is the new norm. Whether this be in her relationships at home, by helping young adults find their voice, she believes everyone can and should strive to become a better communicator. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Hey, Charlotte, this is a pretty unique sort of space. How did you get into communication?
So I guess I've been on the road with communication for a while now, even though it's still a fairly new sort of area of research and stuff like that. So basically when I was coming out of high school, going into university and all that sort of stuff, I was really interested in language and how we use language. And everyone was kind of like, oh, you should go be like a journalist or a writer or this sort of thing. And I was kind of like, that doesn't quite sit where I want it to sit. And I'm kind of like, I want to know more about the why. And I was kind of looking at like psychology and those sorts of things. And then I realized that communication is kind of like the overlap of those two things. It's all the things we do about language and all the whys of why we do those things with language. And so, yeah, I spent 5 years studying that in Australia and in South Korea, because language and communication changes depending on which culture you're in. So I made sure that I got some experience abroad as well in a completely different culture, so I could get a broader scope of what communication actually looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. So everybody says that like communication is like really key to a good relationship. So what are your thoughts about that?
I think there's some interesting things that come out on the internet at the moment, especially because a lot of people are pushing back on the simple communication is key phrase, because I think a lot of people see it and it's not explained very clearly what that actually means or what it actually looks like in real life. And there's been a big pushback on people being like, no, it's not communication, it's comprehension, and then putting all that kind of effort back on the person who's listening to the communication. And from my standpoint, if you're a good communicator, you should be able to reframe your message and kind of work with the person that you're talking to so that you can get things across in a way that they're going to understand, not just the way that it's simplest for you to say it or write it or however you're going to communicate with them.
Yeah, yeah. So when we say, communication is key, that really is taking into consideration that the communication is good, right? It's like,
right.
Because if communication is key, you can communicate. But if it's actually getting your message across as intended, it's probably not very effective at all. So what would you say are some of the foundational communication skills that we need to master?
I'd say that the first one that most people overlook, because they think of communication as talking or expressing themselves. The first thing that I do whenever I go into any new relationship is I spend a lot of time listening. So the more that you listen to someone, they'll actually give you the answers to a lot of problems. And a lot of the time, people don't want solutions to what they're actually talking to you about. They just want to express themselves. And that's totally cool too. But if we think that it's okay for us to just express ourselves and not really have any intent behind what we're saying, other people expect the same too. And they expect you to listen and be able to understand what they're trying to get across on more of an emotional level rather than on a practical level. So step number one is definitely listening. And step two is probably looking for the signs that your communication is not getting through. So a lot of people just think that once they put it out into the world, it's immediately understood, and they don't really check back with the other person if they're on the same page or not. And sometimes you don't need to, like obviously there's just unspoken things, like if people are nodding their head or they finish your sentence for you, they kind of are getting where you're going. But there's other forms of feedback and other noise that exists in our world, like in our heads, all those thoughts that go through our heads all the time. And we often don't see that for other people. Like we don't know which words are going to particularly affect them in one way or another. So with all that noise in mind, really being mindful of who you're speaking to. And if you kind of see their face like change or their body language change very quickly, maybe realize that the wording that you've used probably isn't hitting home with them, or you've struck something that they're not feeling particularly good or confident about that day. And you might need to take it a step back and be like, hey, I noticed that you kind of, you left the room on me as something that you can say to people if they're completely mentally zoned out, or hey, I noticed this made you uncomfortable. Do you feel comfortable telling me about that? Or is there a better way I can approach this in the future? And actually asking people for feedback on what's going on is the best way to create safe and clear communication between two people. Because if you don't ask, you're not going to know. And you're never going to, unless you're very, very good at body language and that kind of communication as well, you're not really going to pick up on why that's happening.
Yeah. So what would you say are some of the traits, we're on a podcast talking about relationships and particularly romantic relationships. What would you say are some of the indicators that a couple or a relationship have really great communication?
I think one of the big things is actually that they're not afraid of conflict. And this is probably true for any solid relationship. Most people think that conflict is inherently a bad thing, particularly in romantic relationships. I know a lot of people in that kind of early stages are like, oh, we shouldn't be fighting. We should be in the honeymoon period. Like, we should be just loving each other all the time. And unfortunately, that's not how it works out in the long run, because there's always going to be disagreements that you have, whether big or small. And your ability to, I guess, get past those disagreements in a way that's beneficial rather than just aggressive towards one another. So in my experience, couples who communicate well will kind of bring up points of conflict from a way that just like, hey, like, I noticed that this has happened. Can you explain to me why you did it that way? Or they'll be like, hey, I don't quite understand what's going on. And they'll come at conflict from a place of curiosity rather than aggression is a really big sign for me. And also being able to set healthy boundaries and being able to communicate those boundaries is a really good sign of a strong couple. And I think that boundary setting and conflict kind of go hand in hand sometimes. Like, you think that in order to set a boundary, you have to approach someone in a way that's being like, well, you did wrong by me. And that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes you can be proactive about your boundary setting and things like that as well. And being able to renegotiate those boundaries if either something bad happens or maybe you grow closer together and you think that, you know, you need to re-examine where you sit on certain topics or certain things.
So what do you mean by boundary? Like, what's your definition of boundary and how do we put them in place?
Yeah, so I think one of the also common misconceptions about boundary setting that a lot of people get gaslighted on, or they might have people tell them that they shouldn't set boundaries, is when people confuse boundaries for expectations. So expectations are things you would like to happen, but if they don't happen, it doesn't necessarily negatively affect you in any sort of way. A boundary is usually something that if that thing were to happen, it has a negative effect on you either physically, emotionally, or mentally. And it's something that usually, for the most part, it can change depending on your closeness to someone. So obviously physical touch and things like that will change as you get closer to someone. But for the most part, a lot of these things are where you kind of can be where you sit morally on subjects as well, and things you might be uncomfortable with anyone doing apart from maybe yourself.
So if we're going, oh, that's interesting, how would someone look at their relationship and go, how can I define what is a boundary versus what is an expectation? And how do we communicate them to our partner if they're different?
Yeah, so I think for the main part of setting boundaries and figuring out what your boundaries are, it does take a bit of internal work. So you actually need to sit down, and there was, I don't want to get too technical on this stuff, but there is a theory by a really old communication scholar who basically talks about how you have different stages in your life, and it's like a big show that you're putting on for everyone. And it's really good to think about, and it's really easy to do it online. You can notice how you change yourself across different platforms potentially, and showing what you're comfortable with everyone seeing, what you're comfortable with some people seeing and knowing about you, and what you're comfortable with only yourself knowing about you. And kind of the actions that then go along with each of those stages of who you are in those spaces is your boundaries, basically. So anything that's kind of like steps over from one zone into the other and you don't feel comfortable with that because it's a threat, you feel threatened in your sense of self or you feel threatened in your sense of safety, that's a good sign that someone's crossed a boundary that you're not ready for them to cross as well. And once again, just that differentiating between, does this actually affect me negatively, or was I just wanting something better to happen? So an expectation is more, I want something more than what I'm receiving, but it's not necessarily negatively impacting you, the after result of that thing not happening, whilst as a boundary usually has some sort of impact on your safety and your well-being if it doesn't happen, or if that boundary is crossed. Yeah,
that's really interesting what you're talking about, because you can have, well, by the sounds of it, you can have different boundaries for different groups of people in your life too. Because like what you said, obviously publicly, like there is a different level of boundary that you can set for something publicly, and then, but you could quite openly share with your romantic partner something that you wouldn't be open doing publicly. So really interesting that there is different levels of boundaries, even though we may not think that.
Yeah, and you have to also realize that you can renegotiate boundaries as well. Like once they've been said, they're not necessarily set in stone. Obviously, that's on you as the person who set the boundary to renegotiate. You can't just expect the other person to read your mind and know that it's suddenly okay for them to do that. Honestly, the easiest way to start doing that is to start having those conversations early. Because I feel like, particularly in romantic relationships, in that first sort of year period, a lot of people feel like there's a lot of unspoken rules or there's things that everyone does. And we need to realize that each relationship that we have is completely different and unique. And that goes for all of our relationships with our family and our friends as well. So even though people think that there is this kind of societal norm of what happens across this time, you actually need to have those, like for me personally, I have those conversations before I even start dating someone. I'm like, cool, this is what I'm into, or this is what I do or don't like, or this is not on the cards for me at all, kind of thing. Just to make sure that I'm not going into a situation with someone whose boundaries or limits or their expectations in a relationship are completely opposite to my own.
So Charlotte, you've clearly done some work with yourself to even know what those are, right? So that you know, for you to be able to go into a relationship and establish these are my boundaries, these are my expectations, you need to have known those. So can you talk to us a little bit about your journey to, I guess, establishing healthy boundaries with yourself?
Yeah. So I feel like a lot of people, when they have really strong boundaries or things like that, have gone into a situation in the past where those boundaries or expectations haven't been met. And for me, that was exactly what happened. I think my previous serious relationship was a good example of that. It was a lot of cheating and things like that involved, and it was long distance as well. So I was struggling to maintain, like, what's the expectation for communication? And then this is kind of where I drew that line of, okay, if this doesn't happen, it doesn't feel great, but it's not necessarily harming me in any sort of respect. Whilst as with the cheating, for me, I was kind of like, okay, that's a hard boundary. I can see how that's not respectful of what I've asked and how that's not respectful of what I have laid down as the foundation for that relationship. And even though it can seem that clear cut in your head at the time, like I know even for me, it took a couple of months for me to fully exit that relationship because it had been across a period of time where I was like, okay, this person's like really cool. And then it turned out everything in that relationship had been a lie. So from lying about age, lying about marital status and things like that, where I was kind of like, had to do a complete 180 on what was going on because I was completely shocked and all these sorts of things. And my hope is that by teaching other people that boundaries and expectations and all these sorts of things can be set at the front, other people don't necessarily have to go through these full kind of life-shattering realizations of
that sounds intense, Charlotte.
Yeah. So, and that kind of also was like a reason for me to move back to Australia as well. So that was happening when I was back over in South Korea, and being able to shift my life back to Australia actually helped a lot. And it made me realize that things that I'd been taking as normal because I was seen as like an outsider in a specific culture, I didn't have to be accepting that because it's not something I would accept in my own home culture. And I think being able to understand that, like, just because people have different expectations and things doesn't mean you need to change yours to suit them. And once again, the best thing that you can do to be proactive about this so that you don't have to go through that sort of situation is really sit down and almost like journal it out, or even if you meditate, like you can meditate on these sorts of thoughts as well. Instead of just being like, what do I need to do to become a better person? Is really thinking about what can someone bring into my life that's actually going to make me feel like they're bettering me and bettering themselves, rather than just focusing on like what you don't want. So you can, once you have like the list of don't wants, like you might not want someone who lies to you, like that might be a hard boundary for some people. And then so you look into that and you're like, okay, so I want someone who has open communication, and I want someone who is very honest with me. And from there, you can actually start building a list of things that you can watch in people's behavior, rather than just having these kind of like, okay, well, if you ever lie to me, I'm out kind of things, which ultimatums like that don't usually work in the grand scheme of life. So instead, you can actually look for behaviors that are more positive, rather than trying to look for negative behaviors in people when you're setting boundaries and negotiating this sort of part of a relationship.
Yeah. So I know that for us, like in our first 12 months of our relationship, we probably had more conflicts in that first 12 months than we have for the rest of our relationship. And I think by the sounds of it, that was probably us trying to establish those boundaries and actually work out
work
out a lot of our expectations and communication styles and things like that. So is there a way that we can, well, I guess you were kind of saying like try and negotiate these up front or talk these things out up front, but is there a way that if we can approach this, I guess, mutually beneficial for both people?
Constructive,
yeah.
Yeah. So I know with myself and for other people's relationships of people that I've talked to, having like a key word that shows that like this is not a space for aggression. So even last night with my partner, he comes into bed and he's just like, I need to be vulnerable. And so that as soon as he says I need to be vulnerable, it means that doesn't matter what I feel in that situation, it goes in a box, goes on the shelf, and it's going to sit there until we're done with this. It doesn't matter if what he says makes me feel like a little bit like if my ego feels attacked or things like that, I'm just going to be like, cool, sit it. You can talk about that later. Right now, I've got someone in front of me who's feeling, like they need a safe space, and being able to communicate the difference between needing just a chat, like who's doing the dishes might be like a bit of a chat. Okay, like you want to divide that up more equally. Whilst as I'm vulnerable usually means, hey, this is something that's quite important for me. And having those keywords that kind of trigger and, okay, this isn't the time for me to react from a place of anger or frustration or hurt, because clearly they know that this is a sensitive topic and they want to talk it out. And also knowing that, like, when you go into conflict with someone, or if you disagree with someone, you don't have to be fighting each other. For me, that's kind of a sign that you've gone past the point of actually solving a problem. Because for the most part, conflict is just problem solving. And I think if you can try and take the emotion out of it that way and come to each other with being like, hey, I have a problem with this thing, rather than I have a problem with you. Because I think that being able to distinguish between those two things as well, and being able to communicate that as well. So when you're going in for these conversations, if you don't have if it's not something that necessarily requires like a safe space or a safe word to kind of start off that communication, you might go in and instead of being like, hey, I hate it when you blank, be like, hey, this situation makes me feel this way. So really trying to remove the other person from what you're feeling, because we all, as much as other people can affect our emotions, it's all of our responsibility to choose how we respond and whether we're going to be constructive with it or not. And for me, one thing that I found that works really well is going in and being like, hey, this situation makes me feel this way. Because it covers off two things for me. One, it means that I'm not saying you did this to me to the other person, which instantly means defense mode is up. They're going to fight back as hard as they can because they feel attacked now. And the other part is that I'm talking about my emotions relating to the situation, which one, it gives them a little bit of clarity and insight into what is actually going on in my head, instead of them being like, why is this such a big thing? And the other thing that it does is it's really hard for people to argue with how you're feeling. And it's kind of, for me, if someone really argues hard and being like, you shouldn't feel that way or you shouldn't do this, that's kind of a red flag for me that maybe that relationship isn't going to work out. Obviously, repeated pattern of behavior, not a one-off thing. Really bringing it back to like the situation and the emotion, and how can we make it sure that you don't have this negative emotion in this situation. Once again, gives it more of that problem-solving edge rather than two people going into battle against each other because one thinks a certain way and the other one thinks a different way.
Yeah. Hey, Charlotte, can you give us an example of what, not quite the script, but what does a good conversation sound like when we're establishing those healthy boundaries with our partner?
So it can be super, super straightforward where someone can be like, hey, when people are dishonest with me, or when I find out someone's been dishonest with me, it makes me feel like I can't trust someone, or I feel really betrayed. And a really good thing to do if you're on the receiving end of this is then probably ask them, okay, why is that happening? So dig in a little deeper, find out what's going on. So a why question is usually really good if they're feeling safe to open up about their emotions or why they particularly dislike that particular situation. And it could be simple as like, well, I don't think that's honest. It could just really be simple like that. Or it could be like, well, this happened when I was this however old or whatever, and go full backstory there if they're comfortable at that point. And then from there, it's really important for the person who's especially on the receiving end to be like, okay, what do you need me to do? And not in like a really aggressive way of like, okay, you expect me to fix all your problems, but more like okay, cool, we've got a problem. We need to decide on a solution. And really, once again, working through it as a problem-solving type activity where you're giving them the chance to solve their own problem for them so that they feel heard and understood. But if they are like, I don't know what I need you to do, what do you think you could do? It also gives them the chance for them to ask for your opinion or ask for your advice in that situation. So you really want to let the person who has the boundary explain why they have that boundary so that they feel like you're seeing them rather than just being like, okay, push it to the corner or whatever kind of reaction. And then you also want to have a set solution or a set guideline, because if you don't have an end goal in this situation, you end up with really vague or grey boundaries that people aren't sure whether they've crossed or not.
One of my favorite little phrases around this is like, clear is kind and unclear is unkind. So even though it might feel quite uncomfortable to express blatantly, this is what I want, or this is what I need, or this is what I'm asking for, leaving it with so much grey area is actually really unkind, because it's hard to know what success looks like.
Yeah. And I think a really good way, because for me, I don't have too much issue at the moment establishing or making boundaries with my partner. But the person in my life who I do have trouble with when they overstep boundaries repeatedly is my mum.
I think you wouldn't be alone in that.
Right. And because like a lot of people's parents especially act out of a place of love, but they might not act in a way that that is actually beneficial to that person. And what you can do is, if you feel almost like your hands are tied, or you feel really guilty for having to set boundaries with people like this in your life because you feel like family and things like that should have access to you, especially if you're protecting your time or things like that, especially as you get older and become professional and going through the whole corporate gig or doing your own business and stuff, you're busy all the time. And so one thing that I learned to deal with this it's called the whole brain response. And usually it's used for children when you're talking to children. But as adults, we need that same sort of care and consideration in our communication as well. And basically what it does is it identifies the emotion that the other person is feeling and then restates the boundary. So you can be like, I understand that this is really frustrating for you, but I need this time to myself. Or I understand that you're disappointed we can't meet, but I need to work on this. And that way you're showing them empathy. You're showing them that you actually care enough about what they're going through to be like, okay, I understand that this is uncomfortable for you. And then the trap that a lot of people fall into with this sort of response is saying, I'm sorry at the beginning. So you don't need to say, I'm sorry. You can just say, I understand what you're going through. And they might then butt in and be like, no, I'm feeling this way, in which case they're giving you more information, and it is opening the floor for better communication, clearer communication. And it's still allowing you to restate your boundary in a way that's not harming them. Because I feel like that's the other issue people have, is they feel like when they go into these conversations, they're going to hurt the other person. And that's not true. You can go about it in a way that's constructive for both of you. And this is one of those ways that's super, super helpful. So naming the emotion and restating the boundary in that order.
And this is a funny sort of thing, right? Because if you're in the beginnings of a new relationship, and Nathan and I are over a decade in and we're still navigating some of this stuff, you're trying to establish expectations and boundaries for yourself with your partner, but then potentially you've got two new sets of parents. Each of you are experiencing a new set of parents who also have expectations and boundaries. I know that for a couple of my girlfriends, the first lap around the sun in a relationship brings up Christmas and Easter and birthdays, and then all of a sudden almost having to share these milestone events with another family can be a really big friction point. And it's our parents have got certain expectations around access to us and our time and those kinds of things. So there's a lot to navigate.
And I think this can be hard for a lot of people because our families can feel like a part of who we are. And I think being able to separate your experience with your family to your partner's experience with your family, because it might be something that's super uncomfortable for them, particularly if people have different cultural backgrounds or things like that. This can be really hard to navigate at times. And I think, once again, having those keywords like being like, I'm feeling vulnerable right now, or things like that, so that if you're in a situation with other people, you can either have like an exit strategy if something really bad's going down, or more of just understanding that if your significant other feels like they can't communicate openly with your family for whatever reason, that's not a reflection on you, that they might just not feel safe in that particular environment. Or they might have different political or religious beliefs where conversation has to be kept at kind of like a shallow depth to keep everyone happy. And that might be also a role that people play. And rather than this being a boundary setting role, this is more of like a mediation role of where you have to go in and be ready to de-escalate things or to talk between two people. And this is annoying when other people force it onto you, where they're like, you tell this person this thing. And that feels hyper aggressive. But you can actually step into this role prior to anything bad happening, particularly if you've had that communication and you know that your significant other feels particularly uncomfortable with one person in your family. You might, or vice versa, you might feel uncomfortable in their family. You might ask that they actually step in and act as as a buffer or a shield. And once again, that's not running away from communication. That's making it work in a way that works for you. So, and also as the mediator, the whole role is just to be in the middle and not take sides. So that you could be like, okay, cool, I see your point and I also see your point, and just allow for conflict in that situation to just sit at a middle point, because it doesn't have to be resolved. And that's the fun thing about conflict as opposed to boundary setting. So when we set boundaries, they need to be hard and we need to actually have like a line around what that looks like. But when you get into just generalized conflict with people, you can have differing opinions, you can have different views of the world, and you don't actually need to meet in the middle if that's not possible on your on your viewpoints. Like, you can actually just choose to disagree with people and keep it civil.
So you've touched on this a couple of times, but like, how do we create safe spaces to have these conversations? You kind of mentioned actually saying like, I'm feeling vulnerable right now, or like, I want to be vulnerable with you. But is there something else to help create that safe space to be able to have these conversations?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting skill that's called in psychology. It's called shelving your agenda, which is kind of what I was briefly describing before, which is where if you realize someone's really upset or they are going through a really hard time, and it's usually pretty easy to pick up with your partners because you'll notice a change in their mood or a change in that, once again, how they're relating to you. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're pulling away. It could just mean that they're stressed, or that they have had a bad day at work, or that there's things in their mind that they don't feel like they can share, even if you are very open with them. And sometimes what you need to do in that situation is, when you notice that they're particularly emotional or down, or that they are struggling in some sort of way, it can be really easy to put the blame on yourself. Particularly in romantic relationships, you can sometimes feel responsible for the other person's happiness. And what you need to kind of do in these situations is step into that mediator role without actually being the third person. And that's, as I was explaining, where I grab all of my emotions and I put them in a box. And this is a temporary thing. It's not, I know a lot of people think that like there's some sort of conflict avoidance here, but this is a very temporary sort of state to be in. And when you put everything in that box, you kind of push it to the side and you allow yourself to view things through their perspective and really listen to what's going on for them. Because a lot of the times, if we're letting our emotions run through our head, all of our communication is going to be coming from a place of fear and a place of kind of trying to react rather than respond, where we feel like we have to jump in and defend ourselves all the time. But if you really make a conscious effort to take your emotions out of it so that you're not on the attack when they say something that might feel aggressive towards you. And in some situations, like, it can hurt at the time. And you kind of just take a mental note and are like, okay, cool, that's not something that I want to discuss with them again, or it's not something that I feel like we should discuss on the regular. And you can mark that down for later when they're in a better mental space for you to have that conversation with them. Before that moment where someone's being really vulnerable or really upset, being able to talk them through it and really be curious about what's going on for them and really understand that what they're going through. And sometimes they just need to let it out as well. Sometimes being in this space, you just will literally be a sounding board for them to just let their emotions out. And being able to be there, and if you're in person and you can like have some sort of physical touch, like being able to just have a hand on them is usually a really good way of them knowing that you're there and that you're listening without you having to interrupt their expression of what's going on for them. And that's a really good way to create a safe space. So really taking the emotions out of the conversation so that they can just feel, one, it makes them feel not judged because they're not expecting someone to jump back in on what's going on. And it also allows for you to experience that moment without your emotions clouding everything that's going on for you as well. It gives you a lot more clarity when going into things like that. And this is something that I had to start practicing with my current relationship. And it's something that I noticed was missing in previous relationships that I had, that I would always feel like I needed to defend myself in these situations, which is a pretty natural human instinct for us. Like, it's pretty hard when someone's saying something that we don't like to not jump in and say that we don't like it. But a lot of the time, it's just that they're coming from a place of hurt and they need to get it out rather than they actually want to hurt you. And I think understanding the intent behind what's going on is also a really good way to know when it's okay to create a safe space versus when you actually do need to stand up for yourself.
Yeah, I really liked that little micro tip that you sort of snuck in there around making sure that you're touching your partner during that, if you're having one of those difficult conversations. I'm not sure at what stage in our relationship that we picked up this skill or trait, but Nathan and I make a point of not having conflict when there's a physical barrier between us. So if we're having a more uncomfortable or a friction conversation, we try and do it on the same level. So we might both be standing in the kitchen, or we might be sitting side by side on the couch but angled towards each other, rather than on one side of the kitchen table and the other side of the kitchen table, or one person sitting on the couch and the other person standing in the kitchen looking down on that person. And just that, making sure that we're on the same level and that we're, truly being present with each other, and then the anchoring sort of touch. I know that that's definitely helped contribute to a much more positive and constructive way that we address conflict now. And I feel like over the duration of our relationship, we've got much better or much faster at identifying what the true conflict is and not the stuff around it, but also that we can move through it a lot faster, but then repair from it a lot faster. And there's not this big angry cloud that sits for sometimes, what in the past had been days or sometimes even weeks. So even those little micro adjustments to how you're communicating and being present can make such a big difference.
Yeah, and I always find a good one is a lot of people when they're feeling angry or sad is their instant emotion, especially in our sort of culture, is to avoid eye contact. And when you're really trying to work through stuff with people, if you can get them to look you in the eyes, it's a way for it to diffuse things. Because what happens if someone's not looking at you, they can't see your emotional response to things very well. And it's why when we're online communicating with people, it's not good to fight online because a lot of...
When you see the comment section blowing up.
It's basically called an empathy gap, and it means all your empathy goes out the window because you don't have someone in front of you giving you feedback on what's going on. Because whether we like it or not, whether there's spoken feedback or not, we can tell a lot by looking at someone's body language, their facial expressions and their gestures. So if someone in the conversation is getting angry because you can tell that they're frustrated about something else or they're hurting about something else, getting them to look you in the eyes, and usually in a very soft way, like you obviously don't grab someone or things like, but just asking them, hey, can you look at me for a second? And especially if you're close in proximity and things like that, it usually creates more of a connecting moment rather than an aggressive moment. So when they look up, they'll finally be like, okay, this is actually a person that I'm talking to. I'm not just talking and venting to myself. And it makes it much easier for you to have those constructive conversations when you're actually looking at each other. And then, if you can, touch each other as well. So hand on the shoulder even, like it doesn't have to necessarily feel super romantic in that moment, but just something that shows the other person that you're physically there with them.
Hey, so we kind of talked about like doing the inner work and kind of figuring out what our own expectations are versus our boundaries. And then once we've identified them for ourselves, communicating them to our partner. But it's inevitable that at some point one of those boundaries is going to be crossed or an expectation isn't going to be met. We're human and you've got two people with different ideas moving through the world trying to achieve things. It's inevitable that there's going to be a friction point. So is there any great strategies or advice for how to manage a situation when a boundary has been crossed and then recommunicating it?
Yeah, so there was a couple that I brushed on really early in the piece, which was one was like the whole brain response. If one of your boundaries has been crossed or someone keeps pushing to cross a boundary and they haven't actually made a move on it yet, it's just to understand that they might be coming from a place of frustration or anger and relaying that back to them. So like, I know you're feeling frustrated by this, but this is what it like, and then restating the boundary right there so that you're allowing them to see that this is really important for you, for one, because you're not backing down on your boundaries, you're not apologizing for it, but you're still coming from a place of empathy and concern for their well-being as well. Once boundaries do get crossed, it becomes a little bit harder to negotiate because obviously a lot of people will feel betrayed once their boundaries are crossed. And this comes back to that self-work that you've kind of done earlier as well. Like for certain boundaries, we might feel like a little annoyed that they were crossed, but for other ones, it can be an absolute deal breaker and you then have to negotiate how you're actually going to go about terminating that relationship, which is a whole different kettle of fish altogether. But for those little annoyances and things like that, I think, once again, being able to try and come into these conversations from a level place rather than a super emotional place, because it's hard to shelve your agenda. It's hard to put those emotions in the box. But if you practice doing it, it does get a lot easier. But when you go into those conversations, it can be one of those times where you're asking to be vulnerable and you're the one asking to be emotional in that situation so that you can relay back to them that they've hurt you. And I think in those conversations, it's really interesting to watch how the other person reacts. Because if they've unknowingly crossed a boundary, like they might have forgotten about a conversation that you had, or it just might be something that slipped their mind in that moment, or they might have been, intoxicated or things like that. And they are really coming from a place of remorse or guilt for what they've done. Watching if they're there for you, watching if they're being like, okay, like I understand that I've done something wrong. How do I repair this situation? Or if they're coming from a place of frustration because they feel stifled by that boundary. Because if they're coming into it from a place of frustration and they're not really respecting your emotions, that kind of tells me that even though for you that boundary is not a deal breaker, for them it actually might be. Like it might be something that they can't take on board as well. And it's watching these differences of behavior, whether people come into these conversations or conflicts or boundary situations with an open mind and curiosity versus whether they're coming into it just to defend what they've done. So people who come in for really defensive and don't really seem to care about what they've done, I think is probably the easiest way to look at it. You need to kind of watch that is this a pattern of behavior? Do they cross a lot of boundaries, and this is something that they do repeatedly, but they're not your big boundary, so you hadn't actually felt the need to take it further than what it is. And I think sometimes the other thing that you can do in this situation is, once again, going back to those really, really basic communication skills, is ask someone, do you understand why I'm saying this, or do you understand what I'm saying? And get them to repeat it back to you. Just ask them, hey, like, I know we've spoken about this, but what did you take out of the conversation? And actually figure out if it is just a misunderstanding, that they completely misunderstood the first conversation that you had, because that can happen too. And asking those questions. And if they did completely misunderstand, then you can talk about, hey, like, that's not what I meant, or you can reframe the conversation so that you're actually, it seems to them in stating a new boundary, but you're actually finding a new way to talk about an old boundary. Whilst as the other option for that is, if they did understand that they did something wrong, you might need to just talk to them again about either why that's a no-no for you, or maybe consider that they're doing this on purpose. And if they're doing it on purpose, you might want to reconsider your relationship with that person.
This kind of plays into that idea that we train people how we will let them treat us. And I think there's a big piece in here around personal responsibility for identifying your boundaries, communicating your boundaries, and holding those boundaries. I've got a mate who's, like you mentioned, Charlotte, having difficulties holding a boundary with their mum, and their mum continues to cross that boundary, and my friend is very lukewarm holding it back up. So it's a reoccurring pattern of behavior because my friend is having difficulties holding that boundary up, and it's continually eroding the quality of that relationship. But there's a level of their own personal responsibility for enforcing that boundary.
Yeah. And I think for me as well, a lot about communication is then being able to notice patterns of behavior. So for me, having done this for so long, I can go into conversations with people, or even talking to other people about people I don't know, and I can pick up on patterns of behavior really quickly. And when you have someone who has a repetitive pattern of breaking boundaries, there's a couple of things that you really need to consider. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about way back at the beginning, which is where you have those stages of where you're comfortable with people seeing you. And this is something that you can actually control. Whilst as you can't really control the behavior of other people, you can control what part of you let them see. And so if you've got someone who's constantly crossing boundaries over and over again, you might actually move them back a stage. So that you might have had them in your backstage area where they saw most of your life and what's unfolding and going on for you. And you might actually move them to front of stage, almost similar to like your public persona of how much information you actually share with them. And once again, that you're not keeping secrets from them or doing things like that. You're not lying by omission or what, however you want to look at it. You're just making sure that you're protecting yourself by deciding what information you want to share with them. And this is really good if you are concerned that people are particularly narcissistic or toxic in those kinds of ways for your mental health. If you only let them see kind of your public persona, they really don't have much ammo to throw back at you. And if they still try at that point, it's kind of just a good sign that you are on the right idea to put them in that space anyway. And that, once again, that's something you can control. It's taking back your control in that situation rather than just letting them come in and do what they want.
I really like that side of stage, backstage, front of stage analogy.
Yeah. It's a good way to think about your life like that as well.
So Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us. Before we wrap up though, what is your number one recommendation for keeping a relationship fueled up?
My number one relationship advice is creating vulnerable time. And whether it is just keywords saying I'm vulnerable, or just having those open sharing moments where you're cuddled up on the couch and you feel like you want to share something with someone and you're close to them, share it. Because 9 times out of 10, they're going to share something back and you're actually going to deepen your relationship with them. And that also creates a much safer space for communication to occur in the future because they've felt safe in that situation with you before.
I look forward to hearing what everyone chooses as their keyword. Because it might not be vulnerable, right? It's like, hey, let's talk pineapple. Hey, Charlotte, this has been really cool. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. This piece that we're talking about is about building a skill and building a muscle in education. So to say thank you for joining us, we've given a month's worth of early childhood education to a class of children in Kenya. The project is looked after by So They Can, and we've done that via our partnership with Buy One, Give One. But basically, the intent is that we promote lifelong opportunities for everyone, starting at that very early stage. So thank you so much for making that possible.
Thank you so much for having me on today, guys.
No worries. So Charlotte, if people want to connect with you or learn a little bit more about what you do, how should they do that?
So if people want to connect with me, the best place to find me at the moment is at the Copy Unicorn on Instagram, all one lovely jumble of letters. And if you are coming in from the podcast, just drop me your favorite emoji in my DMs and I'll be able to have a chat with you a bit more about boundary setting and communication skills.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Thanks for joining us, Charlotte.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Thanks heaps for joining us. If you love what we're doing here and want more, subscribe to the Date Forever podcast to make sure you never miss an ep. Come and hang out with us and other awesome couples who are fueling up their relationships in the Thriving Couples Collective Facebook group, or check us out at fuelcollective.com.au. Until next time, keep on dating, because better relationships equal a better world.